In the spring of 1943, the Tiger tank was the most feared weapon in the world. Not the most powerful, not the most numerous, the most feared. The distinction matters. American soldiers had been encountering Tigers since February 1943 in Tunisia, and the effect was immediate. 8 rounds from a 75mm anti-tank gun bounced off the side armor of a single Tiger without penetrating. American headquarters began receiving reports of engagements breaking off the moment a Tiger appeared on the horizon. Military historians would later call it Tiger phobia, a fear that spread through Allied armored units far beyond what the actual numbers warranted. The entire war produced only 1,347 Tigers. Against tens of thousands of Shermans and T-34s, the Tiger was statistically insignificant. Psychologically, it was devastating. The Tiger's 88mm gun could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman could not respond. Its armor could absorb hits that would kill any other tank. In one engagement in Tunisia, a single Tiger absorbed fire from multiple anti-tank guns at close range before being stopped. Not destroyed, stopped. The crew walked away. This was the Tiger that Alfred Rubel first encountered in the spring of 1943. Rubel had wanted to be a tanker since 1939, submitting 9 requests for transfer before finally being accepted. He had trained as a loader, then as a gunner, fought on the Eastern Front in a Panzer IV, competent, he thought, but outgunned by the Soviets. When he was finally assigned to a Tiger unit, the expectation had been building for years. His first night with the Tiger began with an accident. He had been ordered to guard newly arrived Tigers at a rail station, waiting for morning unloading. Cold. He climbed into the driver's seat. The ignition key was in the panel. He turned it. The engine started. What nobody had told him, on a Tiger, the transmission was always left in gear. When he touched the steering wheel and gave it gas, the tank lurched forward. The unloading chocks were pushed out from under the tracks. The front and rear of the tank hung over the edge of the rail flat car. He sat very still. The morning unloading crew found the tank hanging over the edge. There was no investigation. From this moment, Rubel wrote later, I began to take the Tiger seriously and study it thoroughly. It was not the introduction to the finest tank in the world that he had imagined, but it was an honest one. On the other side of the Mediterranean, American soldiers were about to get their own introduction to the Tiger. Theirs would also be honest. In June 1943, with the North African campaign ending in total Allied victory and 250,000 Axis troops marching into captivity, American units sweeping through the abandoned German positions found something unexpected in an olive grove outside Tunis. A Tiger. Abandoned. Engine intact. Fully functional. The Germans, retreating in chaos, had failed to destroy it. The tank was Tiger 712. Assigned to the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion, which had destroyed Allied tanks at a kill ratio of nearly 19-1. Those numbers had reached American headquarters, the tank crews in the field, the men in Washington trying to understand whether the Sherman could actually win the war it was being sent to fight. American soldiers climbed on it, photographed it, drove it toward Tunis. Photographs show GIs grinning with the specific expression of men who have just discovered something extraordinary. Then Colonel George Burling Jarrett arrived. Jarrett was not a man who grinned at found equipment. He arranged for Tiger 712 to be shipped to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. What his engineers found there would shock them, not because the Tiger was worse than they expected, because it was exactly as good, and revealed exactly why that was a problem. The Tiger's firepower was not a legend, it was a fact. The 88mm KWK-36 gun could penetrate any Allied tank at ranges where Allied tanks could not respond. At 1,000 meters, it punched through 120mm of steel. The Sherman's frontal armor was 76mm. The Tiger could kill it before it could get close enough to threaten. Rubel had experienced this on the Eastern Front. He described it with the unself-conscious honesty of a man who had been in a machine that made him feel, for the first time, genuinely safe on a battlefield. The superiority of Tiger 1 and 2 in firepower and armor over all enemy tanks made us careless. We sometimes stood for hours in one place, without cover or camouflage, and nothing could happen to us. The machine that induced phobia in Allied crews induced something equally dangerous in German ones: the conviction of invulnerability. Against the weapons available in 1942 and 1943, the Tiger's frontal armor was effectively proof. The problem was everything the armor sat on. Rubel described the mechanical reality of the Tiger with the same directness he brought to its combat performance. The engine overheated. When it overheated, water entered the cylinders. The crew removed spark plugs, cleared the water, continued at reduced speed. When overheating burned the cork seals, the engine lost oil. Driver Walter Escherig chewed soldier's bread into paste and used it as a cylinder sealant. This worked, temporarily. The interleaved road wheels were an engineering achievement and a maintenance nightmare. To replace the inner or rear wheels, the crew first had to remove the 8 outer wheels. The amount of work was enormous, Rubel wrote. The lateral drives were, in his words, brittle as a raw egg, failing under any load slightly above average. This was the machine that American engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground began disassembling in the autumn of 1943. The 88mm gun confirmed everything the battlefield reports had described. The optics, the Zeiss gun sight, were better than anything American tanks carried. Then they opened the engine compartment. Then they traced the transmission to the front of the hull. To remove the Tiger's transmission for repair, you first had to remove the turret. The turret weighed 11 tons. Removing it required a 15-ton crane. In a forward repair depot, under combat conditions, you did not have a 15-ton crane. A Tiger with a broken transmission was finished, not destroyed, dead on the side of a road, waiting for equipment that might never come. The conclusion the Americans expected: the Tiger has mechanical weaknesses we can exploit. The actual conclusion was stranger. The Tiger's weaknesses were not mistakes. They were the direct consequence of its strengths. Every design decision that made the Tiger the most lethal tank on the battlefield also made it harder to maintain, harder to repair, and harder to keep running in the conditions that war actually produced. The transmission was at the front because that placement allowed a lower fighting compartment. Logical. But it meant the turret had to come off for repairs. The interleaved suspension distributed the Tiger's enormous weight better than any alternative. Logical. But it meant the crew spent days removing wheels to access wheels. The tight machining tolerances produced extraordinary precision. Logical. But precision in a factory became fragility in mud and cold and combat. Each decision was defensible. Together, a tank extraordinary in ideal conditions and increasingly problematic in real ones. Rubel on the Eastern Front was living in the real ones. The bread paste was working. For now. The Aberdeen engineers filed their preliminary report. It went to Jarrett. It went to Armored Command. In plain language it said, "The Tiger is the finest tank in the world, and it will break your army trying to keep it running." The Americans read this and looked at their Sherman production lines. The Shermans were not the finest tanks in the world, but their transmissions were at the back, and nobody needed bread paste to keep them running. The Sherman was an insult to engineering excellence. This was the honest assessment of anyone who put the two tanks on paper side by side. The Sherman's armor was thin enough that German anti-tank rounds could penetrate it from the front at combat ranges. Its standard 75mm gun could not reliably penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at any practical distance. Its gasoline engine had earned it the nickname Ronson from German crews, after the cigarette lighter whose advertising slogan was, "Lights first time, every time." The Sherman burned. Everyone knew the Sherman burned. American tank crews knew it before they climbed in. They climbed in anyway because the mission required it, and the Sherman was what they had. By every conventional metric, firepower, armor, one-on-one survivability against a Tiger, the Sherman was inferior. This was the finding of American testing programs that evaluated the tank and found it wanting in exactly the ways that combat confirmed. And yet, America kept building Shermans, because the men making the decisions understood something the German engineers who built the Tiger had not been asked to consider. A tank is not a weapon. A tank is a system. The gun and armor were only one component. The other components were production, maintenance, availability, and presence. A weapon that spent more time in the repair depot than the field was not a weapon. A weapon that required equipment unavailable at the front was, at the moment it was needed, not a weapon. The Tiger was the finest weapon in the world. The Sherman was a system that worked. Jarrett's engineers at Aberdeen had documented the Tiger's mechanical demands precisely. The transmission requiring a 15-ton crane. The suspension requiring removing 8 wheels to access 4. The engine requiring improvised solutions, bread paste, when specialized knowledge wasn't enough. The Sherman's transmission was at the rear, accessible without removing the turret, repairable with tools that were actually there. Its engine accessible from service hatches, its components built to tolerances that allowed for mud, cold, and combat. German engineers who captured Shermans found them uncomfortable, cramped, inadequately armored. They were right. They were measuring the Sherman by the metrics that produced the Tiger. By those metrics, the Sherman was inferior. By the metrics that mattered in a 4-year industrial war, the Sherman was exactly right. In 1943 alone, American factories produced 17,000 Shermans. Germany produced 1,347 Tigers in the entire war. On any given day in 1944, there might be 300 operational Tigers on the Western Front, and thousands of Shermans. Not because the Sherman was better, because the Sherman was there. In the summer of 1943, Rubel took his Tiger into combat. He watched Soviet tanks burn at distances where they could not respond. He stood in the open without camouflage because the armor made that possible. What he also did, every day, was listen to the engine. Not casually, with the focused attention of a man who understood that sounds told him whether the machine was about to become a problem. A change in tone meant overheating. A different sound meant the suspension. He had learned to read the Tiger the way a sailor reads weather. At Aberdeen, the engineers were learning to read the Tiger as a machine to understand. What they were understanding would change how Americans thought about the tanks they were building. Not more powerful tanks, better positioned transmissions. The transmission's position determined whether a broken tank could be repaired in the field or had to be abandoned. A Tiger that broke down and could not be fixed was gone, as completely as if destroyed in combat, except without the exchange. No Shermans killed. Just a Tiger on a road in Russia, crew climbing out, engineer planting a demolition charge. The Americans had built the transmission at the back from the beginning. They had already understood what the Aberdeen report was confirming. The decision to build the Tiger had been made in 1941, when Germany was winning. In May 1941, as German forces prepared for Operation Barbarossa, the requirement for a heavy tank was issued, armor-proof against any likely Soviet anti-tank weapon, a gun capable of destroying any Soviet tank at combat ranges. The engineers at Henschel met the requirements. The Tiger was the result. The failure was not in the engineering. The failure was in the timeline written into the requirements. The requirements had been written for a short war, a war in which Germany would achieve its objectives before the Tiger's logistical demands caught up with its battlefield performance. Germany was not having a short war. By June 1943, when Americans found Tiger 712 outside Tunis, the Sixth Army had been destroyed at Stalingrad, and American production capacity had been mobilizing for 18 months. Albert Speer, appointed Reich Minister of Armaments in 1942, pushed to rationalize German weapons production, shift from the best possible weapon to the best possible weapon producible in sufficient numbers. With tanks, he faced 2 obstacles: Hitler, who believed in quality over quantity, and the army, officers who had seen what the Tiger could do in combat and wanted more of them. The Tiger was a tank designed for a war that had not happened. The Aberdeen engineers, documenting Tiger 712's mechanical demands, were confirming what Speer had been arguing. Germany was spending resources at a rate the Tiger's combat performance could not justify. One Tiger cost more than twice as much to build as a Panzer IV, required approximately 300,000 man-hours compared to 70,000 for a Sherman. And when it broke down, which it did, regularly, the repair required equipment Germany increasingly could not provide at the front. The Americans were looking at their own numbers: 49,000 Shermans, built in automobile factories, operated by men trained in weeks, maintained with tools actually available at a forward depot, against 1,347 Tigers. On any given day in 1944, German records showed Tiger units reporting operational readiness of 50% or lower. Half the Tigers were broken. The Sherman's readiness was consistently higher, not because American mechanics were better, because the Sherman had been designed to be fixed. In August 1943, Rubel's Tiger suffered an overheating failure the bread paste could not manage. The engine required proper repair, days out of the line. During those days, American factories were completing 50 Shermans per day. Rubel understood this as the specific anxiety of a man who listened to his engine constantly, knowing that the difference between a Tiger in combat and a Tiger on the side of a road was maintenance he could provide and maintenance he could not. Rubel heard the sounds. He kept the Tiger running, but the ratio was the ratio. The Tiger destroyed 5 Shermans for every Tiger lost. Germany needed to destroy 36 to break even on production. The math never worked. Not in Tunisia, not on the Eastern Front, not in Normandy. The requirements had been written for a short war. Germany did not have a short war. And so the finest tank in the world was built on the wrong question. The Aberdeen engineers were not writing a report about how to defeat the Tiger in combat. They were writing a report about what the Tiger revealed about the philosophy behind it. The philosophy: build the best weapon possible and win quickly. The war: you do not get to choose how long this lasts. When it lasts 4 years, 50 Shermans per day beats the finest tank in the world. In June 1944, the Tiger met the thing it had not been designed to fight. Not the Sherman, not a new Allied weapon, not any tactical innovation that the specification documents of 1941 had contemplated. It met Normandy. The bocage, dense hedgerow country of the Norman interior was the opposite of the Tiger's designed combat environment. Built for open terrain and long engagement ranges, the Tiger in the bocage could not use its standoff advantage. Fields no larger than a few acres, engagement ranges measured in dozens of meters rather than hundreds. And in the bocage, the Tiger's size became a liability. At 57 tons, the Tiger was too heavy for many Norman bridges, too wide for many Norman roads. The vehicle that had been designed to dominate the open steppes of Russia was navigating lanes built for farm carts, losing track links on tight turns, breaking down on road surfaces not designed for its weight. Rubel's unit arrived in Normandy in July 1944. He had survived the Eastern Front, learned the machine as thoroughly as any man could, its sounds, its tolerances, the improvised solutions that kept it running. In Normandy, everything he had learned was insufficient, not because the Tiger had changed, because the war had changed around it. The Shermans were different here too, not individually. A Sherman could still be penetrated by the 88mm at any range the bocage permitted, but there were so many of them. For every Tiger, dozens of Shermans. When a Sherman broke down, there was a replacement. Rubel's battalion arrived in Normandy with its full complement. Within weeks, through combat losses and mechanical failures, it was at 60% strength, then 50. Replacements came slowly. Parts arrived late or not at all. The repair facilities, the 15-ton cranes, the specialized workshops, were further away every week. American forces were studying Tiger 712 at Aberdeen at the same time Rubel's battalion arrived in Normandy. The conclusions of the Aberdeen report were being demonstrated simultaneously in the fields and lanes of Normandy. Rubel could destroy any Sherman he encountered. He encountered fewer of them each week, not because they were getting fewer, but because his own strength was declining. The Tiger that could not be killed was being defeated by the war around it, by the weight limits on Norman bridges, by the 15-ton crane that wasn't there, by 50 Shermans per day coming off American production lines. by the math that never worked, no matter how skilled the crew or how carefully they listened to the engine. The Aberdeen engineers had identified something beyond the specific mechanical problems. The Tiger had been designed without adequate consideration for the men who would maintain it in combat. The men who fought from it found it adequate. The men who maintained it found it impossible. The maintenance procedures assumed tools not standard at a forward position. Disassembly sequences that made sense in a workshop were nightmarish in a muddy field. Tolerances that made components excellent in factory conditions made them fragile when the field introduced variations the factory had not modeled. Rubel had navigated all of this for 2 years on the Eastern Front. Bread paste. Careful listening. The accumulated expertise of a crew that had internalized the machine's demands beyond anything a training manual described. In Normandy, that expertise was still present, but the conditions were worse. The terrain was wrong, the supply lines were stretched, the repair facilities were further away, and the Shermans, the inferior, inadequate, uncomfortable, underpowered Shermans, kept coming. Not 5 at a time, not 10, in the volumes that 50 per day over months produced. Germany had built the finest weapon in the world for the men who fought it. They had not adequately designed it for the men who kept it running. In a war this long, the men who kept it running mattered as much as the men who fought it. Rubel was one of the men who kept it running. He was very good at it. It was not enough. The Aberdeen report was completed in late 1943 and distributed through American Armored Command. It did not change the Sherman. The Sherman was already in mass production, already deployed across multiple theaters, already the backbone of Allied armored forces. The decision to build the Sherman, rather than a heavier, more powerful tank, had been made years earlier, and the production infrastructure built around that decision could not be reversed mid-war. What the report changed was understanding. Before Tiger 712 was disassembled at Aberdeen, American officers had understood the Tiger as a tactical problem. A formidable opponent in individual combat that required specific tactics, flanking attacks, combined arms, avoiding the long-range engagements where the 88mm advantages were decisive. After the Aberdeen report, American officers understood the Tiger as a strategic problem, a weapon system whose tactical superiority was being undermined continuously and irreversibly by its own design philosophy. The report's conclusions circulated through Armored Command, into planning documents, into the thinking of the generals who were deciding how to fight the campaign in Northwest Europe. The conclusion that mattered most was not about the Tiger's armor or its gun. It was about its availability. A Tiger unit at 50% operational readiness was half a unit. Half a unit of Tigers could destroy a significant number of Shermans in combat. But a unit of Shermans at 90% operational readiness was still a full unit. And there were more Sherman units than Tiger units, and they were being replaced faster than they were being lost. This was the strategic mathematics that the Aberdeen report had documented. Rubel was living inside the tactical reality of those strategic mathematics. In the autumn of 1944, his unit was fighting in Germany itself. The retreat that had been inconceivable when the Tiger was designed had become the reality. Rubel's battalion was conducting defensive operations, using the Tiger's long-range firepower to delay advances that could not ultimately be stopped. The Tiger was still exceptional in individual combat. The 88mm was still destroying Shermans. The armor was still proof against most of what the Allies could bring to bear. But the fuel was short. Germany by late 1944 was rationing fuel for its armored vehicles, and the Tiger, with its enormous engine and range of only 100 miles cross-country, was a particularly hungry machine to feed. The parts were unavailable. The spare tracks, the wheel assemblies, the engine components that Rubel had always eventually managed to obtain were not there. The Tiger that Rubel commanded in the autumn of 1944 was the same mechanical entity as the Tiger he had first encountered on a rail platform in 1943, when he had nearly pushed it off the flat car and had sat very still and waited for morning. The machine had not changed. The war around it had. The 15-ton crane had always been a theoretical problem. In 1943, repair facilities had been close enough, often enough, to manage. In late 1944, they were rarely close enough. The bread paste had always been a temporary solution. In 1943, There had been proper sealant available often enough to replace it. In late 1944, there was often only the bread paste. The wheel replacement procedure had always required hours. In 1943, the front had been stable enough to allow those hours. In late 1944, the front was rarely stable for hours. Everything that had been manageable in 1943 had become unmanageable. Not because the Tiger had gotten worse, because the war had gotten longer. And the war had gotten longer because the math had never worked. And the math had never worked because 50 Shermans per day over 3 years was a number that the finest tank in the world could not overcome. Rubel kept his Tiger running. It was, increasingly, the only Tiger running. The German crews who abandoned Tigers in the final months of the war did not do so willingly. The Tiger was not abandoned because its crews had lost faith in it. The kill ratios were still real. The 88mm was still lethal. The armor was still protecting the men inside. In individual engagements in autumn 1944, Tigers were still destroying Shermans at ratios that would have seemed extraordinary in any other war. They were abandoned because the war had outrun the machine's ability to be maintained. A Tiger with a broken transmission needed a 15-ton crane. The crane was not available. The Tiger was destroyed by its own crew, a demolition charge in the engine compartment, the crew walking away from the finest tank in the world, because the alternative was leaving it for the Allies to capture. A Tiger with a broken suspension needed the wheel replacement procedure, the outer 8 wheels off before the inner ones could be accessed. The procedure required hours. The front was not stable for hours. The Tiger was abandoned because the enemy was moving faster than the maintenance could be completed. A Tiger with a failing engine needed Escherig's bread paste, or the proper sealant the bread paste was substituting for. The proper sealant was on a supply truck that had not arrived. The bread paste worked temporarily. Temporarily was not enough. Rubel watched this happen to other crews, then to his own. The date and location are not documented in his memoirs. What is documented is the texture, the decision to destroy a machine he had kept running through years of Eastern Front combat and Normandy defensive operations, made because the conditions that had made maintenance possible no longer existed and were not coming back. He planted the demolition charge. He walked away. At Aberdeen Proving Ground, the engineers had completed their evaluation of Tiger 7 2 months earlier. The report had been filed, distributed, incorporated into planning documents. Tiger 712 itself had been transported across the Atlantic, displayed, eventually placed in storage, where it sits today at what is now the Fort Belvoir Museum as the only Tiger 1 on American soil. Found functional in an olive grove outside Tunis, driven by grinning G1s toward the harbor, shipped across the Atlantic, studied with the systematic attention of engineers who understood that understanding your enemy's best weapon was as important as having your own. What Jarrett's engineers had found when they took Tiger 712 apart was what Rubel had known from the first night on the rail platform. The Tiger was extraordinary. The Tiger was also fragile in ways its armor did not reveal. The armor stopped shells. It did not stop the bread paste running out. It did not stop the 15-ton crane from being 50 miles away. It did not stop the front from moving before the wheel replacement was complete. These were not flaws. They were the price of the extraordinary. The question that Tiger 712's disassembly had answered was whether the price was worth paying. The answer was, not in a 4-year war. In a short war, the price might have been worth it. Tiger phobia might have been decisive, might have paralyzed Allied armored units long enough for German mobile forces to achieve their objectives. Germany did not have a short war, and so the price was paid and paid and paid until there was nothing left to pay it with. Rubel walked away from his Tiger in the autumn of 1944. The demolition charge detonated. This is arithmetic. 1 Tiger destroyed per day by its own crew. 50 Shermans completed per day in American factories. The finest tank in the world, meeting the thing it had not been designed to fight. Time. The requirements written in 1941 had assumed that the war would be won before the mathematics of production and maintenance became decisive. They were wrong. The men who paid for that mistake were walking away from burning tigers in the autumn of 1944. The war ended in May 1945. Rubel survived. He spent time in Allied captivity before being repatriated to Germany. He came home to a country whose physical and institutional landscape had been remade by 4 years of war. He found work in tank development for the Bundeswehr, the new West German army built as part of NATO's defense structure. He brought the specific knowledge of a man who had spent years keeping the finest tank in the world running under conditions it had not been designed for. The tanks he worked on for the Bundeswehr were designed differently, not worse, different. Transmissions at the back, suspension systems serviceable without disassembling half the vehicle, engine compartments accessible from hatches rather than requiring turret removal, tolerances that allowed for mud and cold and combat rather than assuming factory conditions. The Leopard 1, which became the primary West German tank of the 1960s and was exported worldwide, embodied the direct lessons of the Tiger. Excellent firepower and mobility, reasonable armor, designed to be maintainable in the field. The transmission was at the back. Colonel Jarrett, who had arranged for Tiger 712 to be shipped to Aberdeen, died in 1969. But the report his engineers produced had been incorporated into American tank development and training doctrine in ways that persisted through the Cold War and beyond. The M1 Abrams, decisive in Desert Storm in 1991, was designed with lessons that traced back, in part, to the systematic analysis that had begun with Tiger 712 at Aberdeen. Not the firepower lessons, the maintainability lessons, the transmission at the back lessons, the design for the field, not the factory lessons. Tiger 712 sits at Fort Belvoir, not operational, but it runs every time someone asks the question Jarrett asked in June 1943, looking at an abandoned German tank in an olive grove outside Tunis and deciding to find out what was inside. What does this machine tell us about the war we are fighting? The answer was not, the Tiger is too good, we need a better tank. The answer was, the Tiger is too good for the war it is fighting, and that too goodness is what is defeating it. Build a tank that can be fixed. Put the transmission at the back. Design for the field, not the factory. A tank that is always there beats a tank that is sometimes unbeatable. Rubel understood this by the end, as the lived experience of a man who had loved a machine and kept it running and watched it being destroyed one by one, not by enemy fire, but by the accumulated cost of being extraordinary in ways that the war could not sustain. He spent the rest of his career building tanks that were designed not to require bread paste. He did not regret the Tiger. He simply knew what it had cost. This is the accounting the Aberdeen report had begun, understanding not just what the Tiger could do, but what maintaining it required, and whether that could be sustained across a war Germany had not planned to fight this long. The accounting produced a verdict that was not about the Tiger's performance. It was about the war's duration. In a 6-month war, the war Germany had planned, the Tiger's design philosophy was sound. Build the best weapon, accept the maintenance demands, win before the demands become unsustainable. In a 4-year war, the war Germany actually fought, the Tiger's design philosophy was fatal. The demands compounded, the maintenance fell behind. The crews improvised until they could no longer improvise. The tanks were destroyed by their own crews on the roads and fields of a country that had built them expecting to win before it came to this. Rubel planted a demolition charge. Jarrett's engineers filed a report. Both were documenting the same thing. The finest tank in the world, meeting the price of its own excellence. The price was higher than the war could afford to pay. Germany built the perfect tank. By the metrics that matter in individual combat, firepower, armor, the ability to dominate an engagement at ranges where the opponent cannot respond, the Tiger I was the finest tank fielded by any nation in the Second World War. The engineers at Henschel achieved what they had been asked to achieve. Tiger units in Tunisia, Russia, Normandy, and the final defensive battles achieved kill ratios against Allied armor that no other tank matched. A single Tiger, correctly positioned and properly crewed, could hold off multiple Allied armored vehicles. The Tiger was the perfect weapon. America built a good enough tank. The Sherman burned. Its armor was inadequate. Its gun could not reliably penetrate what it faced. Its crews knew this and climbed in anyway because the mission required it and because there was always another Sherman when this one was destroyed. Always another Sherman. This was the thing the Tiger could not defeat. Not the Sherman itself. The Tiger defeated Shermans regularly, at ratios that made individual engagements look like victories. But the Sherman's presence. The specific, cumulative, unrelenting presence of a tank built in automobile factories, maintained by men trained in weeks, repaired with tools available at any forward depot, replaced at a rate that 50 per day over 3 years produced. Colonel Jarrett had understood this when he saw Tiger 712 in that olive grove outside Tunis. The significance took the Aberdeen evaluation months to document, but the question Jarrett asked was the right question. Not, how do we defeat this tank in combat? The question Jarrett asked was, what does this machine tell us about the war? The answer was, Germany built the perfect weapon for a war that lasted 6 months. America built a good enough weapon for the war that actually happened. The war lasted 4 years. Good enough won. Rubel spent his later career working on tanks designed for the war that had happened, not the war that had been planned. Maintainable in the field. Repairable with tools that were actually there. He understood the Tiger's greatness. He also understood that greatness in a 4-year war is not enough. You also need to be there. Tiger 712 is at Fort Belvoir. Tiger 131 is at Bovington. Both survived because they were captured before they could be destroyed, before their crews could plant the demolition charges that ended so many others. They survive as the evidence of what Germany achieved and what Germany miscalculated. The achievement, the finest tank in the world. The miscalculation, that the finest tank in the world would be enough. It was not enough. Not because the Sherman was better, because the Sherman was always there, and the Tiger was not always there. What Rubel and Jarrett both understood from their different vantage points, war is not a test of excellence. War is a test of sustained presence. Excellence helps. Presence decides. The Tiger destroyed more Shermans than the Sherman destroyed Tigers. The Sherman was at more battles than the Tiger. The Sherman won. This was not what the German engineers had been asked to optimize for. They were asked to build a tank that could destroy anything it encountered. They succeeded. The mistake was in the specifications. The specifications asked for excellence in individual combat, not for presence across 4 years of industrial war. When the war lasted 4 years, the specifications became a blueprint for defeat. Rubel had known it since the bread paste, since the wheel procedures, since the night on the rail platform when he sat very still and waited for morning. The Tiger demanded everything. Everything was not always available. And when everything was not available, the finest tank in the world became a 57-ton obstacle on the side of a road, waiting for a crane that was not coming. The question that Tiger 712 answered has not gone away. Every defense procurement decision, every tank design specification, every choice between the best possible weapon and the best possible weapon that can be built in sufficient numbers, all variations of the same question Colonel Jarrett asked in an olive grove outside Tunis in June 1943. Do you build perfect or do you build present? Germany answered, perfect. America answered, present. The answer that won was present, not because present is always right, but because in a 4-year industrial war, presence compounds in ways that perfection cannot match. Every Sherman produced was a Sherman that could be at a battle. Every Tiger not produced because its manufacturer consumed the resources of 2 other tanks was a tiger that was not there. The math was simple. The math was always simple. The math never worked for the tiger, and the math was the war. The Germans had the same problem in every weapons category. The Tiger, the Panther, the Me-262, technically superior to anything the Allies had, appearing in too few numbers too late to matter. Each was a genuine achievement. Each embodied the same philosophy: build the best. The Allies built enough. Rubel died in 2001. He had spent 60 years thinking about the machine he loved, its demands, its failures, what it had meant to keep it running when everything that was supposed to support it was unavailable. He had not regretted the Tiger. He had simply known what it cost. Tiger 712 is at Fort Belvoir. Tiger 131 is at Bovington. Both survived because they were captured before they could be destroyed, before their crews could plant the demolition charges that ended so many others. At Fort Belvoir, Tiger 712 sits as a static exhibit, a machine that was found functional, studied systematically, and then preserved as evidence. Evidence of what Germany could build, evidence of what Germany could not sustain. The report Jarrett's engineers produced is in the archives, not famous, a technical report, circulated through Armored Command, incorporated into doctrine, read by the men making decisions about how to fight the rest of the war. They made good decisions. The Tiger's tactical superiority was being undermined by its own design philosophy, and the correct response was not to build a Tiger of their own, but to flood the battlefield with Shermans. This was the American answer to the Tiger problem. Not a better gun, not thicker armor, more tanks that could be fixed, more tanks that could be replaced, more tanks that were there when the battle started. The Tiger crews in Normandy understood that for every Tiger they destroyed, more Shermans would come. They fought anyway, because the Tiger, even in conditions that were destroying it, was still the finest tank in the world. Rubel kept his Tiger running. He listened to the engine and improvised the solutions and managed the demands of a machine that required more than the war could provide. And then he planted the demolition charge and walked away. Germany built the perfect tank. America built a good enough tank. Perfection lost, good enough won. The transmission needs to be at the back. The bread paste was never a solution. The finest weapon in the world is only as valuable as its ability to be there when the battle starts. The Tiger was not always there. The Sherman was. That was the difference. That was the only difference that mattered. Jarrett understood it in an olive grove outside Tunis in June 1943. Rubel understood it on a road in Germany in the autumn of 1944, watching the demolition charge detonate. The finest tank in the world. Meeting the thing it had not been designed to fight. Not the Sherman. Time. 4 years of it. 50 Shermans per day. The math the Tiger could never overcome.